Hello, this is Jason with Divine Frustrations, and I will be discussing a recent frustration that I received pertaining to interpretations, particularly of the Old Testament, regarding stories and whether or not they are to be understood as literal or figurative. And so the way this person presented their frustration pertains to some of the stories that they described as being far fetched. And they gave examples such as Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, Jonah, and the great fish. And so, what they were basically saying is that some of these things, if you really think about it, just seem hard to believe. And are we to understand them as literal occurrences, or should we understand them in a figurative way, in a non literal, perhaps even non historical way, but yet stories that are designed to convey some kind of meaning or truth or principle, something like that. So I'll discuss a couple of these examples before going into some other principles. So you take Adam and Eve, for example. Now, there are different ways of understanding the history behind Adam and Eve as far as the first two humans that are said to have been created by God. One of the things that we know, and one of the reasons that we have for believing that Adam and Eve in that account is to be understood literally, is because in Luke chapter 3, the genealogy of Jesus is traced all the way back to Adam. So, in that particular instance, he is regarded as a historical figure that actually came before Jesus in his lineage. So, that's one reason that we have to believe that that Adam was a literal person and created by God according to the book of Genesis. As far as Noah and the ark and that whole story, there is a reference to Noah in the book of Hebrews. We do know that. And so that's part of the reason to believe that that was something that really took place. But then at the same time, the writer of Hebrews could also be appealing to this as a mere story that happened without necessarily understanding it to be literal. And as far as Jonah is concerned, well, we know that Jesus made a reference to Jonah where he compared what happened with Jonah to his own death and resurrection. So you may remember the passage where he said, for just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so Jesus will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And so basically saying that he was going to experience something similar by making reference to Jonah. But again, somebody could argue that, well, he's referencing the story, but not necessarily describing Jonah as a historical figure. So there are different ways of understanding those particular accounts. They don't have to be, at least in the last two examples that I gave, they wouldn't have to be, at least according to New Testament teaching, understood in a purely historical sense. Even if they were to be understood in figurative ways, they would still have the meaning that they are designed to convey. But that said, there is something that we probably want to be mindful of, and that is that there is a tendency to interpret things, such as the person who provided this frustration described these stories as far fetched. And there is the likelihood or the possibility that we may interpret certain things that maybe to us don't make sense or are hard to believe and want to interpret them in figurative ways for that reason. And that's not necessarily where we have to go because remember, the Bible is presented as a supernatural book that has been revealed by a supernatural creator. And so there is a sense in which we should expect for there to be supernatural elements within it. And we see that. We see miracles in the Old Testament, we see miracles in the New Testament. So, what it really boils down to is not whether or not the stories make sense or whether or not they seem far fetched or simply hard to believe, but whether or not we can accept God's way of doing things as the supernatural creator of all things, whether or not we can accept and embrace the reality that God may do things different than, say, what humans might be inclined to do from time to time. And God's ways and God's reasoning for doing things the way that he chooses do not necessarily have to be explained to us or don't necessarily have to be reasonable to us. But if that's the way that God chose to do things at a particular time with specific people, then that is something that can be accepted. And it can be accepted as a literal understanding of what happened. So we should expect for there to be, because again, we're talking about a supernatural creator with supernatural power and has his own will to get his things accomplished in the world. So we shouldn't be surprised that we read things in the scriptures that go beyond our natural everyday experiences, because we're talking about that kind of God, and those things are revealed in the scriptures. So coming across something in the scriptures that seems to be far-fetched or out in the ordinary or just simply hard to believe does not necessarily have to discourage us or not necessarily have to lead us to the conclusion that they're not actually historical in nature, that they didn't literally happen. They might have very well been historical, literal occurrences, but we shouldn't, or we don't have to default to the view that if something seems to be that much out of the ordinary, then that means it probably did not happen in real life. So we can accept what it says, we can accept the way it happened if it is communicated in a literal or a figurative way. And whatever the message is, whatever the lesson is, whatever we're supposed to understand about that passage or about that story or that account, then we can take it and accept it for what it's worth and just ultimately trust that we're still getting the message, whether we interpret it literally or figuratively. So more could be said about this, but I would say that that's a general starting point regarding some of the topics that were presented in light of this particular frustration.